Imagine taking a Soviet anti-aircraft gun from the 1960s, a weapon built when rotary phones were still considered futuristic, and dropping it smack dab into the middle of a 21st century drone war. Some weapons retire gracefully, others get dragged out of storage, wiped down with WD-40, and shoved back into the fight because history refuses to cooperate. And then there's the Shilka, technically the ZSU-23-4, a Soviet relic that should, by all rights, be sitting behind a velvet rope in a museum next to ashtrays once used by Brezhnev. Instead, the Shilka is back on the Ukrainian battlefield. It's killing drones its designers never imagined, using radar modes that didn't exist when the Beatles were still touring. It is, once again, saving Ukrainian brigades that were rebuilt on the fly after 2014, and it is now receiving the most meaningful upgrade in its 60-year life. 16 of them, to be exact, all ordered for modernization by the Comeback Alive Foundation, Ukraine's largest and most respected non-government military charity. This is a civilian-funded upgrade to a Cold War icon, arriving at a moment when Ukraine's air defenders are drowning in Shaheds. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Wes O'Donnell, military veteran, law grad, and I've spent years covering Ukraine's battlefield innovation, how they take Western weapons, Soviet leftovers, anything with a trigger, and turn it into something Russia truly hates: effective. This is the kind of plot twist only a modern war can write. A retired Soviet anti-aircraft gun being resurrected to shoot down Iranian drones, all while Ukrainian engineers rip out old Soviet electronics and replace them with digital fire control systems that can track a target the size of a crow. Let's break down how we got here. There was a brief, glorious window in the mid-1960s when the Shilka was the meanest thing on tracks. NATO pilots learned this the hard way. The system forced the U.S. Air Force to rewrite the manual for how low-altitude strike missions were flown. Fighter bombers that once skimmed treetops to avoid radar suddenly found themselves inside a death triangle of 23mm shells before they even realized anyone was tracking them. The Shilka was lethal, not because it was elegant, but because it solved a very specific Cold War problem with brute efficiency. You marry 4 autocannons to a radar that doesn't blink, bolt it onto a tank chassis, and tell the gunner to pull the trigger the moment the needle twitches. That level of volume and accuracy was unheard of in the 1960s, and it scared Western air forces into changing tactics overnight. In Vietnam, in the Israeli-Arab conflicts, and anywhere Soviet clients fought against Western equipment, Shilkas chewed through aircraft that were never designed to survive a wall of metal that thick. While specific numbers for NVA Shilka kills in the Vietnam War are difficult to isolate from overall anti-aircraft statistics, light anti-aircraft artillery, including towed and self-propelled 23mm and 37mm guns, were responsible for the majority of U.S. aircraft losses to ground fire. But battlefield supremacy has a short shelf life, and by the late 70s, attack helicopters with long-range anti-tank missiles started popping up, literally. They didn't need to sprint past the radar. They could sit miles outside the Shilka's envelope and fire with impunity. Jet aircraft climbed higher and carried guided munitions, and as avionics became more digital, the Shilka's analog brain started to show its age. Soviet designers did what they usually did when a legacy system hits its limits. They built something heavier, faster, and packed with missiles. Enter the Tunguska, and with it, the end of Shilka production. Once the USSR dissolved, the Shilka took on a second, sadder afterlife. Former Soviet states inherited them in bulk. Most didn't know what to do with them. In Ukraine, they were stacked in depots that nobody bothered to heat or maintain or even guard properly. Western advisors, still trapped in the early 2000s mindset that Europe's wars were over for good, encouraged Ukraine to cut costs and downsize. After all, terrorists were the new bad guys. Big peer-to-peer wars were over, or so they thought. The result was predictable. Hundreds of Shilkas were parked, forgotten, and slowly reclaimed by rust. Crews were reassigned, spare parts vanished, mechanics retired. You could visit Ukrainian storage yards in the early 2010s and find Shilkas sitting on sunk suspension, tracks rotting away, and hatches powdering with corrosion. They weren't weapons anymore, they were relics of the Cold War, a war with no monuments, no parades, only casualties. Thank you, Marco Ramius. Then 2014 arrived, and suddenly every piece of tracked armor the country had ever mothballed was yanked back into the daylight. The old apex predator started showing its teeth again. When Russia grabbed Crimea and lit the Donbas on fire, Ukraine suddenly found itself trying to rebuild an army that hadn't been maintained in a generation. Almost every brigade needed something heavy, something armored, and capable of putting real steel into the air. The Tunguskas all went to elite Ukrainian mechanized units. The new brigades, like the 56th, 57th, 58th, and 59th, had to take what existed in the depots. That meant Shilkas. The problem was that most of them didn't work. Some hadn't been powered on since MC Hammer was on tour.
It's hammer, go, hammer, empty hammer, yo, hammer, and the rest can't go in play, can't touch it.
Others had been scavenged for parts. A few had trees growing through them. But Ukrainian repair teams brought them back slowly, painfully, and with whatever budget could be scraped together. And when they reached the Donbas, something unexpected happened. The Shilka found a new purpose, not as an anti-aircraft gun, but as a ground fire monster. In trench warfare, 23mm autocannons melt Russian infantry positions, knock down tree lines, and shred Soviet-era vehicles that are too light for tank fire and too close for artillery. Once the Minsk II agreement restricted heavy weapons, Shilkas ended up doing far more ground combat than air defense. By 2022, when the full invasion started, they had become the go-to second echelon gun truck in several brigades. Like many crusty Cold War veterans, they were old, they were loud, they were temperamental, and they were effective. But they were starting to go blind. The original Soviet radars couldn't see shit by modern standards. That's where this new modernization package comes in today. The Ukrainian upgrade that turns a museum piece into a drone killer. What Ukraine has done with the Shilka isn't modernization in the Western sense. There's no billion-dollar program office, no glossy briefing deck, no TV marketing campaign. Also, can we pause for a moment and appreciate how absurd American defense contractor commercials are in the US? I mean, who the hell is going to purchase a B-2 Spirit bomber? These commercials are made at great expense for an audience of one, that chief Air Force procurement officer at the Pentagon. Anyways, what Ukraine did was far more honest. It looked at a weapon built when rotary phones were considered high-tech, and it asked a simple question. What's the minimum we need to change to make this thing kill drones today? The answer became the ZSU-23-4 A1 upgrade, and it is a case study in wartime engineering. The most important change sits right on the top of the turret, the Rokosh AS radar. The original Shilka radar could track jets, but it was blind to the small, low radar cross-section drones that define modern warfare. The Rokosh AS fixes that. It can pick up UAVs with cross-sections so small, they barely show up on a police speed gun. Suddenly, this Shilka isn't hunting 1960s aircraft, it's stalking the things Russia sends by the hundreds every night. Then there's the computing system. The old analog calculator inside the Shilka might as well have been powered by steam, and it handled target solutions with all the finesse of a Soviet Mr. Coffee. Ukraine happily ripped it out and replaced it with a digital fire control brain that reacts in milliseconds, not seconds. That change alone means the crew can engage a drone that only appears on radar for a few fleeting moments before it darts behind cover. Ukraine also added a navigation suite and digital to analog converters that make the system far more autonomous. The original Shilka needed external data and coordination to be truly effective, but the upgraded version can hunt independently, it can scan independently, it can track independently, and it can kill independently. In a war where positions shift constantly and drone swarms appear out of nowhere, that autonomy is essential. So what makes this upgrade transformative is the way it matches the modern threat. Russia sends Shaheds that cost $20,000. Ukraine is not going to waste a $300,000 missile shooting them down. The Shilka, firing 23mm rounds, fills the sky with dense, lethal metal at a fraction of the cost. Now, this shouldn't work. No engineer in 1964 designed the Shilka with Shaheds in mind. But war doesn't care about design intent. It cares about the results. And the upgraded A1 version of the Shilka gives Ukraine something few countries possess right now: a cost-effective way to turn mass-produced Russian drones into flaming lawn darts. It's a museum piece rebuilt for a war nobody predicted, and the lessons here are obvious. Sometimes the best weapon isn't the newest, it's the one you can adapt fast enough. So, all hail the Shilka, a budget Gepard with a Ukrainian brain. And unlike Russia, which is still dusting off 50-year-old OSA missiles and pretending that's modernization, Ukraine is actually rebuilding these systems with modern electronics. The difference shows on the battlefield. Russia's Shilkas mostly get used as mobile suppressive fire. Ukraine's Shilkas are finding drones their enemies can't see, with radar modes that didn't exist on the Soviet originals. That's the difference between Russian improvisation and Ukrainian innovation. Some weapons never die, they just wait for the battlefield to catch up. The Shilka was born in an era when jets flew low and fast. It matured in an era when helicopters launched missiles from beyond its reach. And it retired when surface-to-air missiles took over. And then drones arrived and turned the sky back into a gunner's world. That's why the 16 upgraded Shilkas could be a turning point. Every one of these vehicles represents a brigade that suddenly has a fighting chance against the cheap terror Russia throws at it every night. It represents a victory of engineering over nostalgia. And it represents a small but critical shift in the most cost-sensitive domain of modern war: air defense. Ukraine doesn't have the luxury of building an entirely new air defense doctrine from scratch. It has to fight with what exists. But what exists can be transformed. The Shilka proves that. The upgrade proves that. And the fact that a 1960s Soviet weapon is now hunting Iranian drones for a 21st century Ukrainian army says everything you need to know about who is actually adapting in this war and who is stuck in the past. That's it for today, my friends. Subscribing is the best free way to support these videos and helps me push back against Russian disinformation. And as always, glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes. Crimea is Ukraine.